The Our Planet series launched on Netflix in April 2019. In just the first month, it was watched in over 25 million homes around the world, and is already Netflix's most successful documentary series ever produced. It was the first series of its kind to carry an important conservation message at its heart. It set out to showcase the wonder and variety of life on Earth and reveal why this biodiversity is so important to the health of the planet. The Our Planet team are carrying this message beyond the series.
Right now, we are in the midst of the Earth's 6th mass extinction. One every bit as profound and far-reaching as that which wiped out the dinosaurs.
This is a story that everyone needs to know.
Fundamentally, biodiversity is the key to the future of humanity.
Most people understand that a changing climate is a threat to our future survival. But few know that the loss of our biodiversity is just as grave a threat.
There'll be no jobs on a dead planet.
For too long, we have overseen the destruction of the wild animals and wild spaces on our planet. And we are now beginning to feel their loss. But we must not give up hope, for there is a path, and it's a clear one.
We can create a much better world, but it won't happen by default. It won't happen automatically.
This film will reveal just why our biodiversity is so important and the role business can play in saving our planet.
The business sector has no option but to be a force for change.
Earth, as far as we know, is unique in its capacity for life. Millions of species, billions of individuals. Each with their own characteristics, leading their own lives. But lives that are connected intimately to the lives of others around them. This is the Earth's great biodiversity. It is a wonder to behold, and yet so easy to take for granted. Our planet has not always been like this. Before life, Earth was a wasteland. Its climate was chaotic and wildly unstable. Its atmosphere, a turbulent mix of noxious gases. And its oceans and lands poisoned. It was the evolution of life that changed all that.
Life has undoubtedly served to create more and more comfortable conditions for life itself on this planet, creating the soils on the planet, creating a stable atmosphere, and creating better conditions for successor species.
The more diverse and complex life on Earth became, the more it was able to capitalize on the growing opportunities that arose. The more productive the living world grew.
There's been this remarkable development through to an amazing diversity, millions of different species, all of which are dependent in some way upon each other.
And now our planet is alive. It operates just like a living, breathing organism. Its habitats, made up of countless different species, work like its organs, each with a different role to play in keeping the planet healthy. Our planet's poles act like an air conditioning system, reflecting sunlight away from the planet to keep it cool. The sea ice works like a soil, harbouring algae, which underpin the hugely productive food chains in the cold oceans. Freshwater systems transport life-giving water and nutrients throughout the landscape, crisscrossing its surface like the arteries and veins in a body. Immense forests straddling the globe, and trillions of microscopic floating plants in the surface of our oceans maintain the atmosphere by locking away carbon and releasing oxygen. Coastal mangroves and coral reefs act like breakwaters, protecting the lands behind from the eroding waves and creating the perfect nurseries for juvenile fish. And jungles pile plant upon plant to capture as much of the sun's energy as possible. The water and oxygen produced in this process reach far beyond the forests. For any one of these biomes to work, the plants, animals, fungi, and microbes within them must all play their part. Only as an ensemble can the living world work its magic. Biodiversity equals stability. And no species on Earth has benefited more from this fact than us humans. It's no accident that we have risen to dominate the planet in the last 12,000 years, a geological age we call the Holocene.
And can you imagine, the average mean temperature on Earth fluctuates during this whole period, since the last ice age until today, plus minus 1 degree Celsius. Plus minus 1 degree Celsius. I call it the Garden of Eden for humanity.
The Holocene was the most stable period of time that we know of, a period of calm that gave birth to our modern civilization.
And you know, it's this stability that gives us all the seasons. You know, we started to realize, hey, look here, it seems like it starts raining every year at the same time in May on the savannah. And it rains roughly 20, 21, 22 times until it ends in October, now going into a dry season. And it does so every year. The monsoon just harmoniously comes back and leaves, come back and leaves. In the temperate zone, you see that temperatures exceed 15 degrees Celsius just at that point in spring, and then it goes on, and then suddenly at the solstice in October, the temperatures go down. And this has given us our cropping seasons, our 90-day plus season from planting to harvest. And we know now that it was the invention of agriculture which took us on the journey towards the modern civilizations as we know it.
Blessed with this moment in time, we developed with incredible speed. We set down roots. Our populations began to rise. Discovering fossil fuels, we mechanized our societies.
By 1955, we're 3 billion co-citizens on Earth. We have so far not had any impacts at the planetary scale. We're still the small world on a big planet. But that is the moment. 10 years after the Second World War, there is technology, there is reasonable peace, there is trust, and that's when we enter the Great Acceleration.
The Great Acceleration, which continues to this day, has been a period of unprecedented change. We have achieved a great many things during this time. Technology driving advances throughout the globe. Our world becoming connected as never before. And, above all else, business has boomed. No other period of time has seen such productivity and growth. As many people became richer, GDPs rose, diets changed, we ate more meat, farming techniques intensified, and fishing fleets got bigger and more efficient to match our demand. Life expectancy and quality of life for many around the world improved dramatically. In the last 50 years, the number of people on Earth has more than doubled. Each new citizen, a new customer, keen to experience the benefits of the Great Acceleration.
Just over the past 50 years, we have embarked on an exponential rise of unsustainable exploitation of resources, unsustainable pressures on the planet, which has now reached such magnitude that science concludes that we have become our own geological epoch.
Welcome to the Anthropocene, the age of humans. We are now the dominant force of change on the planet. 3/4 of the land surface and 2/3 of the ocean are impacted by our activities. Our poles are losing their ice. In the summer, there is 40% less Arctic sea ice cover than there was in 1980. Many of the world's great rivers and lakes are drying up.
Lake Chad. 50 years ago, it was 25,000 kilometers square of water. And now, 90% of the water just evaporated. Around the lake, you have more than 40 million people living. Everyone wants to access to the shrinking resources.
Almost half of our planet's forests have been felled for their timber and to make space for ourselves and our livestock.
About 60% of global deforestation, tropical forests of the planet, is to produce beef. About 30% is to produce crops, mostly soy in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia, palm oil.
Mangroves full of colour and life are being cleared to make way for shrimp farms and beach resorts. And at sea, our extensive overfishing is leading to the collapse of key fish stocks. We have already lost 90% of large oceanic predators like tuna, sharks, and swordfish.
The cod stocks crashed back home in Newfoundland, where I was from. And, thousands of people thrown out of work, boats beached, canneries emptied. And what was interesting was that you can build up an economy and culture for hundreds of years, and it can be wiped out overnight unless we protect our environment, protect our ecosystems. And that was the real wake-up call. And I think that's where I began to understand that there'll be no jobs on a dead planet.
We have replaced the wild with the domestic. We and the animals we raise to eat make up 96% of the weight of mammals on Earth. Just 4% is made up of wildlife. Half of the fertile land on the planet is now farmland. Our takeover of the natural world has been so successful that in the last 50 years, populations of wild animals have declined on average by 60%. This global loss of nature is already making the planet less stable.
We are today the first generation to know for certain that we're putting the whole planet at risk. Can you imagine? The maximum temperature variability over the whole Holocene is plus minus 1 degree Celsius. We are above that already today.
As the planet warms, weather systems are becoming less predictable. Deadly storms, fires, and floods are all becoming more frequent and more severe. Over 90% of people on the planet breathe dangerously polluted air.
I have just become a grandfather. I have a 1-year-old grandson. He is in Mumbai right now as we speak, and I worry, like all grandparents do, and I worry about the pollution in Mumbai. I wake up every morning wondering, is something damaging his lungs? There is a sense of urgency in India which I think is going to spur action and innovation. It's about staying alive.
It's only as we have started to lose things that we have begun to realize the true value of nature. As Earth's biodiversity drops, things we have taken for granted start to disappear. Clean air and water, the food we eat, the soil it grows in, a benign climate, productive seas. A healthy world provides us and our businesses with all of these for free. But if we were to place a value on them, the services that biodiversity provides for us are estimated to be worth twice as much as the entire globe's GDP. The destruction of our natural world is already costing us trillions of dollars every year. Suddenly, the costs of the age of humans are outweighing the benefits.
We are at risk of entering a danger zone where we could trigger irreversible and self-amplifying change which could push the whole planet ultimately away from the desired equilibrium. We are at risk of destabilizing the whole planet.
If we continue with business as usual, scientists predict that a baby born today could barely be in her 20s by the time the soils of the frozen north thaw, releasing their locked methane, and any chance of controlling the climate is lost. She could be in her 30s when the last of the coral reefs collapse as a result of ocean acidification and warming. By the time she is 60, overuse of fertilizers and pesticides could have killed off soil microorganisms and pollinating insects. There would be no more fertile soil. The weather becomes increasingly unpredictable, leading to a global food crisis. Supply chains in multiple sectors may have broken down. As she reaches her 80s, our planet could be 4 degrees warmer. She may have lived through the extinction of countless species. Large parts of the Earth may be uninhabitable. And global peace, an impossibility. The cost of dealing with this future, if even possible, is estimated to be over $550 trillion, almost double the entire wealth in the world today. Our current trajectory leads to a catastrophic future. But it doesn't have to be that way.
The Anthropocene has both a negative and a positive side, thanks to the fact that we are now so clever and so dominant, and we can use our own intelligence and our technologies to become positive Anthropocene engineers and Anthropocene stewards. So it's up to us. We are the ones now in the driving seat determining the future for the whole planet.
We have to understand the moment as a fundamental fork in the road in human history, in which we must make an active and thoughtful choice. While our past has been written, our future is yet to be determined and is in our hands.
This is not about saving our planet. This is about saving ourselves. We are the chief beneficiaries of our biodiverse, stable home. Our civilization won't work without it. To change this situation will require action on an industrial scale and at an unparalleled speed. We have just 10 years to drastically alter our path before it will be too late to avoid catastrophic changes to our planet.
It's about understanding that this is critical. We have to increase our forest cover. We have to restore degraded soils. We have to clean up our rivers and our oceans. We just have to. It's not about, wouldn't it be nice? No, it is an absolute imperative.
We need revolutionary speed, right? We need a green revolution, and it needs to happen at the scale and at the speed of the digital and internet and mobile revolution.
And what drove the speed and scale of these revolutions? Business. The same force that powered the last period of global change can also power the next. If we can reimagine business as usual and make it fit for our planet, a finite world that works best the wilder it is, we will be in with a chance.
Every company needs to turn the lens on itself and ask, how are we designed? And how does the way we're designed shape what we can and can't do, who we can and can't be in the world?
The broad strategy for this new business as usual is clear. We just have to make sure that everything we do, we can do forever. This means all of us must ensure our investments and supply chains strive to achieve 5 universal goals. We must transition from fossil fuels. Successful businesses will embrace the clean technologies that now exist to replace them.
Are we going to run out of wind and sunshine in Texas before we run out of fossil fuels? I'm betting on wind and solar. First and foremost, I'm a businessman, and the original decision was it was a business decision. How can we have cost certainty over the long term and mitigate price volatility? Wind and solar won out.
Renewable energy already accounts for 1/3 of global power. The faster we can complete the transition, the better our long-term gains. The living world is faltering, partly because we're taking up too much space. Sustainable businesses will help us reduce our impact on land as much as possible. Logging and managing forests selectively. Employing new technologies to produce as much as possible from as little as possible. Growing crops on already deforested land. All of this will help to reduce the amount of space we take up,
When my father bought this property 15 years ago, he cut the forest. I started to planting the first trees. We planting the first citrus, the first bananas, and I started to introduce life again in the ecosystem. Today, we don't need to cut down more forests. We have enough land in this planet for production for everybody.
And it is business that will invent brand new sectors to bring about the most unexpected solutions.
We're trying to build a world where in 10 years or 15 years from now, the majority of the meat and the majority of the eggs produced on this planet didn't require an animal, didn't require all this land, didn't require all this water, and we can enjoy it just the same.
New ideas and land management strategies will help us protect our biodiversity and feed more people with less land. The health of the ocean is critical to the way our planet operates. Future businesses will respect it as a resource that belongs to all of us, only taking what it can naturally replace.
When you set aside 1/3 of the reef, you are opening up 2/3 of the reef for fishing, but 1/3 is being protected. That will actually sustain the population of the marine life that you're fishing in the open 2/3 area. We want to do our share of providing food for the rest of the world, but we have to do it in a sustainable manner.
Technological advancements will help businesses prove the sustainability of their supply chains, giving consumers more power to choose sustainably sourced products. We live on a finite world, yet we don't act like it. Next generation businesses will design their product lines to fit within circular economies.
We need to create industries that don't use things up, but use them again and again and again. Waste from one process becomes food for the next. There's no such thing as waste, actually. Waste is just a resource in the wrong place. That's even true for carbon dioxide. It's true for plastics. It's true for everything that we think we're throwing away. There is no away. And so we need to create economies that actually have infrastructure that enable that circular design.
All businesses will seek out their place within the cycle.
I have seen amazing number of companies really innovating at the top of their game, actually looking at their products and solutions and say, okay, instead of taking virgin resources, can we look at waste materials? Can we turn trash into treasure? Can we innovate and offer sharing business models in which we reward consumers for being more eco-friendly, or we enable communities to make money from their trash? And I think this is a revolution that's happening, and I'm very excited to be seeing it. Even the most complex global business communities will work to eliminate waste.
We asked all of our suppliers to tell us exactly which material was in their packaging. And we said, by the end of 2019, we want to take no material into our business that's not recyclable. Can you manage that? If we do set a standard, actually most of our suppliers will want to come with us. We can do that. But as responsible business, why wouldn't we?
The most damaging element of today's society is its quest for perpetual growth.
We've got an economic system that expects, demands, and depends upon growing forever. How does that reconcile itself with a thriving planet?
Growth for growth's sake will have to lose its attraction.
We cannot think of economic success if we're deteriorating the environment. And I think that has to be in the essence of each person that want to lead a country, that want to lead a company.
The new sustainable economy will readdress this.
We need to create economies that allow us to thrive whether or not they grow. But something can thrive without getting bigger. It's just thrumming, alive, creating, regenerating, doing well, and it looks great to us, and we feel the energy in that.
Our reinvented model for business as usual will ultimately begin to mimic nature, adapting to thrive within the finite world about it. Indeed, there is no alternative.
We have come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not.
And the signs are that the next generation of customers, employees, and CEOs already knows this.
This is our last chance to act before the world as we know it collapses.
I think there's a huge change in the way millennials think about business. If you ask any other generation, what is the purpose of business? They'll say, what color is the sky? The purpose of business is to make money, of course. If you ask millennials that question, 47% said some version of the purpose of business is to improve society and protect the environment. This is a fundamental sea change in the way an entire generation thinks about business. It's going to mean if you want to attract the top talent and retain them, if you want to win over millennial customers and attract the $30 trillion of capital that's currently being given to millennials by the baby boomer generation, you're going to have a narrative around how your products are sustainable and healthy. You're going to have an impact story as well.
Sustainability is now the only business plan, which means sustainability is now a business imperative. So the vital thing the business community needs to do is come together to encourage politicians to set the global frameworks that will accelerate progress to a sustainable world.
If we have political leaders that are investing in renewable technologies, that are investing in sustainable technologies, that are promoting products that are both good for the populace, that people will love, and that will prevent this climate crisis, then we'll get there even faster.
We humans are the greatest problem solvers the world has ever known. We will solve this problem too.
I committed on behalf of my 225,000 colleagues that by the year 2040, the entire Mahindra group of companies would be carbon neutral.
For both palm oil and soy, we have sustainable sources for 100% of what we sell within the UK and in Central Europe, and about 40% in our Asia business. So we have a commitment to get to 100% in total.
Our generation, we want to abolish the use of fossil fuels, and that gives me a lot of hope because it is possible.
Companies that embrace the transition can prosper and even gain advantage.
I think that in the future, when we look back, there will be two types of companies. Companies that got it and companies that didn't get it. I know which segment I'd like to belong to. I'm hoping that we're going to be out in front cleaning up, and a lot of the opportunities that come before other people recognize this very simple truth.
The only viable future is one in which business innovates to demand less of our world. In that future, the wild will recover. And as it does so, bring back the stability and productivity that we rely on. Since commercial whaling was banned just over 30 years ago, some species have recovered from all-time global lows to numbers not seen in hundreds of years. Some areas of ocean protected from fishing have seen fish biomass increase by over 400% in just a few years. Wherever we leave space, forests, wetlands, grasslands, and mangroves will regenerate.
Now we have shown that it's possible to reverse deforestation. We have done that in the last decades. We reached 20% of our coverage with forests, and we managed to increase that to 50% currently.
As they grow back, the wild plants will lock away carbon again, helping us fight against a changing climate. The animal pollinators and seed dispersers will return. The sea ice could start to build at the poles once more. The weather we rely on for our supply chains could fall back into regular rhythms. Our planet can rewild, and as it does so, become more biodiverse and more stable, which is exactly what we humans need to thrive. We can restore the balance of nature, fix the relationship between our planet and our business, and change the way we live on our planet for the better, forever.
Nature once determined how we survive. Now we determine how nature survives.